In keeping with the purpose of this channel, I've been giving all my videos off the top of my head, and because of that, sometimes they come across as being disorganized, and I repeat myself a lot. So there have been a couple of videos where I have used cheat sheets, and I think I may start going in that direction anyway, just because every time I record a video, I think it's something that I wanted to say, and so I'll have to like add something onto it, or I just kind of let it go. So I made it myself another short little cheat sheet today. Hopefully it will help. But I'm trying not to use it too much because I don't want it to just totally interfere with what I'm trying to accomplish, which is to learn how to speak fluently, how to keep my train of thought. That's the difficulty of speaking for me, is keeping my train of thought. And my mind will just go in every which direction, because, I'll start going in one direction and I'll think, well, I could go in this way or I could go this way, and I don't know which way, so I end up just hopscotching all over the place, and it just comes across as being disorganized. I apologize to those of you for whom this is painful listening, but it's painful listening because I'm just not a very good speaker, but that's the purpose of the channel, is for me to get good at speaking. Okay, so, and also to get more comfortable with it. And I am starting to get more comfortable with it. I don't think I've really improved so much in my ability to do it, but I am improving in my comfort level, so that's a good thing. So in the last series of videos, I talked about the kalam, or is it kalam? I don't know. I've heard it pronounced both ways. Every time I hear myself say kalam on the video, it irks me a little bit. It sounds wrong. So maybe I should start saying kalam cosmological argument. It's weird. Saying kalam sounds wrong, but hearing kalam sounds wrong. So I don't know. But anywho, today we're going to talk about the argument from contingency. This is another argument I just kind of stumbled onto on accident a long time ago. I started thinking, well, it can't be the case that there was ever a situation in which nothing else existed, because if there was ever a situation in which nothing existed, nothing would exist now. So there has to be something that has always existed. That was my original argument. I stumbled on that one. I later learned about the argument from contingency, which is essentially the same thing. It's just a little bit more sophisticated, a little bit more honed. So I'm going to talk about the argument from contingency. So there are two kinds of statements that you can make. Or two kind of truths that there can be. There can be contingent truths and necessary truths. Necessary truths are things like 2 + 2 = 4, or circles around. That's an analytic truth. An analytic truth is where it's kind of like just a definition. The thing on the predicate is the same as the thing on the subject. So 2 + 2 = 4, I guess, could be considered an analytic truth. So all analytic truths are necessary truths, but possibly not all necessary truths are analytic truths. But anyway, a necessary truth is a truth that has to be true. It's impossible for it to be otherwise. So like any statement about the laws of logic are necessary truths, math, geometry, things like that. Contingent truths are things that don't have to be true. I made a video today. I didn't have to. I could have not made a video today. So the fact that I made a video is a contingent truth. So for contingent truths, there's always something that makes them true. There's like a truth maker or something. It has to correspond to the way things really are. Necessary truths also have to correspond to the way things really are, but the explanation for their truth is just the fact that they couldn't have been otherwise. The law of non-contradiction could not have been otherwise, and so it's true in all possible worlds. So just as there are necessary truths and contingent truths, there are also necessary beings and contingent beings. And what I mean by being is just anything that exists. I'm not talking about an animal or a conscious thing. By being, I just simply mean anything that exists. So there are necessary beings and contingent beings. If something is a necessary being, then the explanation for its existence is that it's impossible for it to not exist. And the definition of for a contingent thing, it's possible for it to not exist. So most of the things in our experience are contingent things, like cars. If there was ever a period of time in which cars didn't exist, then obviously cars are contingent things because they didn't have to exist. So if it's possible for something to not exist, then it's a contingent thing. And if it's a contingent thing, then it has some explanation, usually in the form of an external cause or something that made it exist, some external thing that provides the explanation for why it exists. There's a third category of things called brute facts, and I will talk about brute facts later. But for now, I'm just going to talk about necessary things and contingent things. Now, what I'm going to argue is that it's impossible for everything to be necessary. It's impossible for everything in existence to be contingent. And there are two reasons. One is because if everything were contingent, then it would depend on something else for its existence. And that other thing would also be contingent. So it would depend on something else for its existence. And you can see that there's going to be this infinite chain. And while I'm on infinite chains, let me also say that this argument from contingency is different than the Kalam cosmological argument, because the Kalam cosmological argument argues for a cause from the beginning of the universe. The contingency argument doesn't do that. In the contingency argument, the universe could be infinite in the past and still be contingent. So, like if you had this infinite chain of contingent things, the whole chain could still be contingent. And so you wouldn't be explaining why things exist just by supposing that there's this infinite chain. If it turns out that the universe is a necessary thing, then we can stop our explanatory regress there. But if the universe is contingent, then we have to look for something beyond the universe to explain its existence. But this chain of contingent things can't go back forever, because I'm gonna give an argument, a kind of a thought experiment for the impossibility of an infinite regress of contingent things. And keep in mind that this regress, there are different kinds of regresses. There's explanatory regresses, but there's also causal regresses. And so, like, you can think of causes and effects happening one after the other. Well, the contingent argument isn't talking about those kinds of things. It's talking about explanatory regresses. So, for example, you could have a book sitting on top of another book and sitting on top of, you have books stacked on top of each other, and suppose they were there from all infinity, from an infinite past or whatever. They've always been there. Still, the explanation for why this book is at a certain height is because of the book below it. And the explanation for why this is at a certain height is because of the book below it. So this cause and effect relationship doesn't have to be like a temporal cause and effect. One thing happening to another. It could just be an explanatory or a static causation situation. Let's say that I need a pen and I don't have one, so I'll go to my buddy and I ask him to borrow a pen, and he says he doesn't have one either, but he'll go ask his buddy, and he goes to ask his buddy, and his buddy doesn't have one either, and back this goes. They just keep asking somebody else if they have a pen. Well, if this regress goes back forever, then that just means nobody actually has a pen, because for anybody for whom somebody asked to borrow a pen, that person has to borrow one from somebody else. That means that nobody actually has a pen. And if nobody actually has a pen, then I will never get a pen this way. The only way I can ever have a pen passed up to me is if there's somebody who actually has one that doesn't have to borrow it from somebody else. In the same way, a contingent thing cannot get its existence from an infinite chain of contingent things, because something has to have existence that didn't get its existence from something else. And so, if all contingent things do get their existence from something else, that means that all explanatory regresses have to end with a necessary thing, something that has existence by necessity. And the explanation for its existence is just the impossibility of it not existing. So that means that there has to be a necessary being of some sort, at least one. So now the question comes down to whether or not the universe is the necessary thing, because if it is, like I said, we can stop our explanatory regress there. There are a few reasons to think that the universe is not necessary. And some of these are not necessarily the strongest arguments. They kind of they rely a little bit on our intuitions and stuff. And when I say intuition in this case, I actually am talking about kind of a hunch or whatever. I explained in my series on epistemology that in the philosophical sense, an intuition is not a hunch. It's just a rational insight. Like, you can kind of see in your mind, thinking about it, that 2 + 2 is 4. Not only is 2 + 2 4, but 2 + 2 must be 4. It will always be 4, no matter whether I'm adding bananas or apples or pennies or electrons or whatever. 2 and 2 will always make 4. I can just rationally see that in my mind. That's knowledge by intuition. But in this case, I actually am talking about kind of a hunch. And the hunch is, based on kind of a rational insight. But for me, anyway, it's not a clear rational insight. So let me say what some of those reasons are. One of them is that it seems to me that anything that's composed of parts cannot be a necessary being. And the obvious reason is because if it's made out of parts, then it can be disassembled. So like a car can be disassembled and the car will no longer exist. You separate all the parts. In the case of the universe, I guess all the parts are being separated because it's expanding and stuff like that. In the case of the universe, that may not apply because no matter how far apart you spread the parts, you're still going to have the universe. It's just going to be bigger. But still, I do have this kind of intuition that if something is made out of parts, then it's not contingent. And the universe is made out of parts, therefore the universe is not contingent. So it would seem that if something is necessary, then it must also be fundamental. In other words, it must be something that cannot be further divided into separate parts. And so if the universe is necessary, then even though you can separate all the parts and stuff like that, it must still be made of fundamental parts. And there have been lots of suggestions about what those fundamental parts are. The ancient Greeks, Democritus, people like that would say that the universe is made out of atoms. And then, later on in history, we discovered atoms. We called them atoms anyway, but it turns out that they were not fundamental, that they were made of protons and neutrons and electrons. Well, some people think that electrons are fundamental, but protons and neutrons are not, because they're made out of quarks. Each one has 3 quarks. And so those particles may or may not be fundamental. I don't know. In string theory, the most fundamental things are tiny vibrating strings, and these strings vibrate in like 10 different dimensions, and the geometry of the dimensions and the vibration and everything determines the property of them and whether they turn out to be a quark or an electron or whatever else they turn out to be. In quantum field theory, it's quantum fields that are fundamental, and particles are just vibrations within those fields. So in any of these cases, you'll have multiple parts. So if it's subatomic particles, well, you've got a multitude of subatomic particles in the universe. If it's fields, well, there's a field for every particle. There's a electrostatic field, electric field, Higgs field, etc. And there's some debate about how many fields there are. Some people think there's only 2 fields, but in any case, there's multiple fields. In string theory, there's obviously a gazillion vibrating strings out there. And in M theory, you also got vibrating brains or membranes or whatever they're called. So anyway, this brings me to my second argument for the contingency of the universe, is that I don't think that something that is contingent, I don't think that there can be some fixed number of contingent things. Like suppose hypothetically that there are a fixed number of atoms or a fixed number of subatomic particles or something. Who knows what that number is? 10 to the 80, 10 to the 500, who knows? But it's a fixed number. Well, if all those things are contingent, if all those things are necessary, then it would follow that the number of them is also necessary. So if hypothetically there were 3 necessary things, well, then the number 3, it would be necessary that there were 3. Well, that seems counterintuitive to me, Because why would this specific number be necessary and not like one more? Why would it be 100 and not 101 or 99 or something like that? And so it doesn't seem to me that things that make up like a certain number can be necessary. And so it just kind of resonates more with my intuitions to say that if there is a necessary being, that there's only one of them. That to me does not grate against my intuitions. Or even in infinity, if there were an infinite number of particles or something, that would be more intuitive than to say that there's some fixed finite number of them. But I've already argued in previous videos that an actual infinity is impossible. But still, one thing is more intuitive or agrees more with my intuitions than an infinite number of things. So I think that if there is an infinite being, that there must only be one of them. And it would have to be a simple being, not composed of parts. So obviously the universe doesn't meet any of those criteria, which makes me think that the universe is not necessary. And if the universe is not necessary, then there's some non-physical, necessary being not composed of parts that's responsible for everything else that exists, every contingent thing. Okay, I want to mention one of William Lane Craig's arguments that I don't think is a very good argument for the contingency of the universe. He said you can just imagine in all the parts of the universe and just in your imagination replace every electron with a different electron, or replace every subatomic part with another part that's just like it. Well, then you'd have a completely different universe. And just this thought experiment is supposed to make you see that the universe is contingent. I don't think that argument works for two reasons. One is because you can play the same thought experiment with God. I mean, I can imagine in my scenario that God gets replaced with another God just like him. So I don't think conceivability really helps me adjudicate between a necessary thing and a non-necessary thing, because I don't see any way that you can, or I don't see any way you could object to applying that same thought experiment to God without begging the question, because the only reason you couldn't apply that to God is if you already knew God was necessary. And it would be God's necessity that prevented you from doing that thought experiment. So I don't think that's a good argument. So I think this argument complements the Kalam cosmological argument, because in the Kalam cosmological argument, you end up with this being that brought everything else into existence. And that kind of raises the question, well, if the whole universe is explained by this creator, what created the creator? Why is the creator there? Now, you can't answer that in the Kalam cosmological argument by saying, well, this being, existed timelessly. And if it existed timelessly, then it couldn't have come into existence if it existed timelessly. It's just eternal. Only if something is temporal can it have come into existence. So that's one thing. But the argument from contingency adds on to that it's a necessary being. And so in both cases, you've got a being on the one hand that exists timelessly and causes the universe to come into existence, and you've got a being on the other hand that exists by necessity and is the explanation for everything that exists. So those seem to be the same being, because in both cases they both explain the existence of the entire universe, so it's probably the same being. So that's how the contingency argument supports the Kalam cosmological argument, by explaining how it is that this creator exists. It exists because it's a necessary being. But the Kalam cosmological argument also kind of helps with the contingency argument, because it gives you an additional reason to think that the universe is a contingent thing. It's contingent because it had a beginning and it came into existence. That's another reason to think that the universe is contingent. So the two arguments are kind of like they help each other out. So to me, when you've got two independent lines of reasoning or evidence or something that all kind of converge on the same thing, that just the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. There you go. Okay, so one last thing to talk about is brute facts. Brute facts are contingent things that are true but didn't have to be true, and there's no reason for why they're true. And so the argument from contingency relies on the principle of sufficient reason, which is the idea that for anything that exists, there's a sufficient explanation for why it exists. In the case of necessary things, it's because of the impossibility of them not existing. And in the case of contingent things, it's because something caused them to exist or sustains them in existence or explains their existence or something like that. So to say that there are brute facts is to deny the principle of sufficient reason. Alexander Pruss, or Pruss, or however you pronounce his name, sorry about that, sir, if I'm mispronouncing your name. He's got a book about necessity. I don't remember the name of the book, but it's a defense of the principle of sufficient reason. And I have not read that book, but I'm just mentioning that in case you want to go read up on this subject. But for me, the principle of sufficient reason has a lot of intuitive appeal to me. And it seems to me that while I can't, logically and with certainty rule out the possibility of brute facts, it seems to me that the only reason you would ever suggest a brute fact is just to avoid the force of this argument. I mean, why would you ever say, when would you ever accept the explanation that something just is and there's no reason for it? You wouldn't do that unless you were just trying to avoid some unwanted conclusion. And so it seems to me, if you're ever in a situation where, something exists and you can say, well, exists for a reason or exists for no reason, it seems like the default position or the most reasonable thing to assume is that it exists for a reason. It's never reasonable to say that there's no reason for why it exists. And so I don't think that brute facts could ever be rationally justified, even though I allow for their possibility. So I think the argument from contingency is a pretty good argument. And again, like I said in the previous argument on the Kalam cosmological argument, this argument by itself does not prove the Christian God. This argument combined with the Kalam cosmological argument does narrow the scope of things that exist. Now you've got a necessary simple being that is responsible for creating the universe. And so we can go on to look at other arguments. And that's what I'll do next. I think the next argument I'm going to talk about is the fine-tuning argument. It's either going to be that one or the moral argument. I haven't decided yet. I'll let you know. There you have it.